Hey, everybody. If you're hearing rhythmic snoring, that's not me, that's my cat. She's the reason I'm now covered in fuzz. Let me see. I don't see your share request, Tom. Can you ask again? Either that or I'll just guess everything that you were going to say and run the presentation for you. Happy to do it. I mean, realistically, it might be that I'm the one who's broken. Interesting. Okay. Let me close any of my other hop-in windows just in case. And then let me leave the session and jump back in because there was a moderator approval mismatch to correct a second ago. All righty, I am back. I still don't see. You might have to leave the session because I don't know if it'll re-raise the request since I joined after you requested. Oh, okay. Worst case, I can bug your co-host. I wonder if I can just force you into the spotlight. I can report you. Probably not what we need. There you are.
I'm in.
Magic.
I gotta act like it's a hacker movie.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in.
I think we got it, Chunga. Thank you. Either that or you got it. There you go.
Okay. So, should I just take it away, Patrick?
Yeah, I think we're good to get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us after what is probably the lunch break or the networking hour for most of you. Happy to have Tom back on here for the banana problem. I didn't read the entire abstract, so I'm really excited because right now there are a whole bunch of stories floating through my head about exactly how we can draw parallels between the banana growing industry and salt. So I will give the rest of this to Tom. We're a couple of minutes behind the hour. I think we have kind of a critical mass of people. Let's get moving. By all means, raise any questions in the Q&A. Otherwise, we can bring people up at the end. But I will give it to you to take away, Tom. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Patrick. So I'm here to talk about the banana problem. Some of you may be familiar with my presentations on the banana problem over the last year or so. About a year and a half ago, I came up with this concept of comparing the banana growing industry to tech. And first presented this concept at Black Hat, and then we did a Hacks episode on it. And for a while, it was one of our top listened to Hacks episodes. And we got a lot of positive feedback on the banana problem. And so I've continued to kind of build on the idea of the banana problem, this idea that when we have a completely ubiquitous approach to something like we do with banana growing, that there are a number of liabilities that we run into, and then we need to be very cognizant of these. And that this is very important for us to look at as we look at really how to navigate really complex situations, not just tech situations. And so let me talk a little bit at first about what the banana problem is fundamentally, the banana growing problem. Some of you may not be aware, but back in 1965 and through the 50s and earlier, the vast majority of Americans ate a different kind of banana than we eat now. We ate what was called the Big Mike banana, or the Gross Michael banana. And in 1965, the Big Mike banana was deemed no longer economically viable to grow as a crop. Now, they're not extinct. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, the old kind of bananas are extinct. You can buy a bunch of Big Mike bananas for like $100 if you want. They're just a little expensive. They're not economically viable to be on your shelves in a grocery store. And apparently these bananas ship better. They're a little tougher skinned. They're significantly sweeter. They don't bruise as easily. It's easier to control how and when they ripen. Like, apparently everything about these Big Mike bananas are just better. But in the 50s, there was an outbreak of Panama disease, which is a fungus that very specifically targeted these bananas. But the Big Mike banana didn't have any genetic diversity. And so it was just not sustainable. You'd put a crop up and they would just die. Because for those of you who are familiar with fungus, fungus is one of the most amazing and wonderful things, and it does amazing and wonderful things for humanity and the planet in general. But when it turns on you, your host. And so they plant Big Mike banana trees and they just die. And so in 1965, the banana growers around the world decided to switch to Cavendish bananas to replace the Big Mike banana on store shelves. And Cavendish bananas are still good. I like me a banana. But everything I've heard is that they're not as good as the Big Mike banana. And I have to admit, this time, while I was putting this presentation together, I almost always get this. So I've used this picture before, and I get this picture from a company that sells Big Mike bananas. And to get a bunch of Big Mike bananas, it costs something like $80, right? To get what would be $3 worth of Cavendish bananas. And this time, I think I'm going to order some so that I can try out some Big Mike bananas. But so the big thing to understand about the banana problem is that what we're really looking at here is the double-edged sword of ubiquity. The double-edged sword of saying, I've got a way that works and I'm going to follow that way. That model of what works has all sorts of benefits because we have ubiquity. It's so much easier to manage something when all of the questions already have answers. But it's a double-edged sword. And it is dangerous to go alone. The heart of the banana problem is that we need to look at both sides of the issue. We need to have an understanding of balance and what makes something strong, and what makes someone strong can also make them weak. And the true effectiveness is found in balance. One of the things that I found really interesting about life is there's an old, I'll call it a saying, that exists and is derived primarily from a number of different ancient religious texts, which is that your weaknesses will be made strong. And I've talked to a lot of people who've rolled their eyes at this over the years, and they say, if I just focus on my weaknesses, it doesn't necessarily help, or things of that nature. And I would rather describe it not as your weaknesses can be made strong, but that you can derive strength from the acceptance and understanding of your weakness. And so at the very heart of the banana problem, the argument that I make is that the banana crop is strong, obviously. We have a lot of bananas. But what we need to do is be proactive about understanding and accepting the weaknesses in the models that we follow. When we understand and accept those weaknesses, only then can we find balance. And in that acceptance, we can find new innovation. And through it, that is where strength is derived. It's not as simple as an old philosophical or theological answer that says, if you have weaknesses, they will become strengths. But much more importantly, if you accept weaknesses, if you don't use weaknesses as an excuse, but rather look at them and say, this is a challenge that I have, how am I going to deal with this? Then you will also be able to find the ways in which those weaknesses give you strength. And that's where bananas are a double-edged sword. They are ubiquitous. They are the same. We have this giant Cavendish banana crop, which is vulnerable to the fourth iteration of Panama disease. And we're struggling to keep bananas on the shelves right now. And to the point where we're looking at genetically engineering bananas, which is difficult because not everybody likes genetically engineered food. And so what this does is we can step back and look at what it means to have a single-minded approach. The banana problem or the banana crop is very tunnel vision. It is very much a single-minded approach to solving a specific problem. There are a lot of benefits around tunnel vision. And there are a lot of benefits that can be found through a deep, direct focus. And so I'm not going to be the kind of person who just says that's a bad idea to put the blinders on. Sometimes it's a great idea to put the blinders on. To be able to step back and say, I need to laser focus over the next generally short period of time towards solving these specific problems. Remove the distractions. Forget about the strategy and the big picture, because that won't matter if I can't take care of what's in front of me. That myopic, single-minded way of thinking can also be very beneficial when you're doing things like creating a restaurant franchise or running a large infrastructure. You want your systems to have as much consistency as possible. And you want your thinking to have a lot of consistency because your decision-making is sped up, because your management is significantly easier when you have that consistency. But that type of tunnel vision, again, has its own weaknesses. Inside of your strengths is where you will often find weakness. And that can be something that can be hard to admit and hard to look at. Because the human mind loves tunnel vision. We love to have answers predefined for us. That is why we gravitate towards communities and we feel safe there, because we feel that these are areas and places where everyone agrees with me and therefore I'm safe. I don't have to worry about the complexity or the threats that are out there. And then sometimes those communities that were once safe can become toxic. And because of the single-mindedness of it, that's typically where we run into communities that over time become hypocritical communities. And they become toxic and go the way of the Big Mike banana. And so communities that we have need to understand how to evolve. Technology that we have needs to recognize the weaknesses inside of the ubiquity of our decisions. And we as people need to understand those constructs as well. And so at the very heart of the issue is a philosophical concept known as an axiom. The idea of an axiom is that you have a foundational construct that you can use to derive higher levels of logic. So in mathematics, there's a concept called the ZFC axiom, or ZFC? Yeah, I think it's ZFC axioms. And this idea is that if you can fulfill any of these 6 axioms, then you have solved any mathematical problem. One of those axioms is that 1 is a whole number. And so therefore we have defined a subset or a broad subset of mathematics. Generally in mathematics, we assume that a 1 is a 1. You've got to be into a divergent form of mathematics to assume that you can have large values of a whole number. But that becomes an axiom upon which we can derive higher levels of math. Another axiom is that eventually if you have 2 sides of an equation, they can reduce down to both sides equaling the same thing, or more precisely, both sides equaling 1. If you have equilateral operations on both sides at a time. But so again, those are axioms that we can base higher logic on. We would not be able to create higher level mathematics without axioms. We would not be able to create complex software without axioms. Some of the axioms that we run with that we may never even think about are buried deep inside of how programming languages work, or they're cultural axioms that we deal with from a technical perspective, or they're assumptions and best practices that have been used for a very long time. Having these axioms mean that we can actually make decisions and we can have higher level conclusions. But the problem that we run into is that if we have a single axiom that derives a large scale of our decisions, like bananas do, then we can end up having vulnerabilities. If something happens to that axiom, then that can disrupt a significant portion of what we do, how we think, how we behave, how we deploy, and how we build. And so it's very important that while these axioms can be massively helpful, that we understand that axioms are still just human constructs, and that we should seek to understand the axioms, where they came from, why they're there, and why they're important. That only by understanding why something's a best practice will we ever be able to deal with the fact that that might not be a best practice tomorrow. It might not be the best way to do this in years down the road. And so we begin to realize that, yeah, there were a lot of benefits with the banana crop, because the axiom of they're genetically basically identical means that these are really easy to grow. But as soon as there was a problem with that crop, we were losing entire fields. So the next thing about axioms that's really important is that, generally speaking, we look at an axiom and we think, Oh, it's a best practice. I can base a lot of my assumptions on this best practice. But the more complicated something gets, the more we as humans crave axioms because it is so difficult to understand complexity. The world around us is getting exponentially more complicated day by day. And from a technical perspective, it's more complicated because there's just so much more code that we have. There are so many more options that we can work with. And we have to make so many more decisions about what's being deployed, what's being used, how we're managing infrastructures, how we're building architectures. And these decisions are oftentimes far more complicated than, frankly, we'd like them to be. And there are so many different pitfalls that I'm going to argue we didn't have to deal with in the past. And that's because we have to deal with a larger scale today as well. When we create a web app, it's not like it used to be where we would say, okay, I've got an SQL database and I've got an Apache server. And if I need more Apache servers, I can spin up more Apache servers and I put behind a load balancer. The glorious old days of just managing a LAMP stack. Whereas now what we do is so much more complicated. And so one of the other things I want to emphasize from the banana problem perspective is how much we crave axioms. And the fact is that we will find axioms and make them up if we have to. This is a significant challenge in the broader world today. Without pointing fingers, I'm sure that we all can think of somebody else who believes or agrees with something that we think is absolutely nuts nowadays. And that this is far more prevalent today because we have to deal with a world that is significantly more complicated than it used to be. And so the human reaction is, please, give me an axiom. And even if that axiom has no bearing and is completely imagined, people will still gravitate to it because it will give them answers and give them a way to move forward. So what we're looking at is a need to accept the level of complexity. We have to be able to look at ourselves and realize that there's so much that we just will not know, and that's okay. There's so much that we're never going to be able to fully understand, and that's okay. What we need to be doing as people is to step back and own our own shortcomings, own our own lack of knowledge. Otherwise, we will never gain more. And in doing so, we'll be able to discern and properly navigate axioms that don't themselves have a good foundation. As we begin to understand that if something's been an axiom for a long time, there's probably a good reason. And that before we dismiss it wholesale, we should try and understand why. And only in understanding why can we truly evolve our understanding of the circumstance. And so let me step back and look at this from a technical perspective. If we look at something that's incredibly complicated, that we don't have any idea as to how it works, but it does. Oftentimes, as soon as we hit a limitation with that system, we get angry and we say, there's another option, I'll go find another option. If we step back and say, I need to understand why this decision was made, and dig in, then we're going to be able to broaden our own understanding of why all of those larger assumptions exist. When we are able to accept those larger assumptions, then it becomes possible to say, look, here's an old construct that was built that didn't account for new ideas. And this is how they can be incorporated. But at the same time, and I'm going to argue more importantly, the new ideas are able to respect the benefits of the old construct. So from a technical perspective, we have this terrible habit of chasing panaceas, chasing universal solutions to problems. We desperately love these. Oh, this is the new way to do something. And what we do is we yo-yo back and forth between foundational constructs and ideas. We yo-yo back and forth between, for instance, highly distributed and dynamic code to statically compiled and delivered code. I thought it was absolutely hilarious to watch about how I go back 15 years and I was teaching Linux classes about how great it was that we have such a well-tuned shared library system on the Linux operating system. And now, over the past 5 to 10 years, all of our programming languages have been built to avoid a general purpose dynamic linking system because we kind of capped it out. And then at the same time, we've come back and built a highly distributed dynamic linking system instead of using microservices with Kubernetes. And so the ideas are still alive and well. We just tend to bundle them up differently. Is it better that we have monoliths, or is it better that we have microkernels? And so as we yo-yo between these ideas, it would make much more sense if we stepped back and said, what are the benefits of idea X and idea Y? Is there a way that we can balance these two things? Because what happens over and over again is that yesterday's axioms create weaknesses and vulnerabilities today. When we have aggressive constructs that we have used in the past, and those aggressive constructs get overloaded into more and more situations, the cracks show. And generally speaking, when we sell a new construct, we sell it as the completely myopic only way to think. And that drives me absolutely insane. Because there's no such thing as one magical universal way to think or solve problems. Otherwise, we'd be a heck of a lot more advanced than we are now. Because somebody would have found something. Instead, it's really important to be able to look at something and say, why is this working and what are we trying to do? And accept that new constructs and ideas are oftentimes throwing away lots of things that made sense in the past, despite the fact that we blindly move forward and follow them. And so what this leads us to is a question of, do we have any other examples that we want to follow? One of my favorite that I've used a lot is a cybersecurity example. Cybersecurity and developers were separated years ago. They were separated for really good reasons. If we go back into the 90s, we realized that we needed to start creating cybersecurity experts who specialized in the security aspect of things because it was too complicated to have developers need to wear that many hats. But at the same time, the developers realized that once somebody stepped into the cybersecurity realm, they oftentimes didn't have the capability or the knowledge needed to be able to repair the fundamental problems that they were pointing out. And so we created an axiom that a cybersecurity specialist would generally do penetration testing, look at the system from the outside, and then log what the vulnerabilities were. And then they would send those vulnerabilities back to developers. We separated this idea of saying that developers needed to have a better understanding of the security of their code for good reasons. Frankly, it's asking a lot. Not everyone can be Dan Bernstein. For those of you who don't know Dan Bernstein, great guy, brilliant engineer, kind of a nut like most brilliant engineers are. Fantastic fellow. But building secure systems splintered And we ended up in the situation where we have today, where we have very real problems because we continue to follow hard axioms that were established over 20 years ago. And those real problems we have in cybersecurity right now is that it is impossible to keep up with dealing with the security issues that come up. And it's impossible for infrastructure management to be able to constantly patch and update those cybersecurity, those complex infrastructures. And there are so many different layers and pipeline components we have to deal with now. It just didn't exist 20 years ago. And that's why we have to fundamentally rethink how we manage cybersecurity as a whole, which is why things like the SecOps movement rise up. Not because, as has happened in the SecOps movement, we should just use automation tools to solve security problems. No, that is not the answer. It is understanding why. So I just saw a comment, and yes, Dan Bernstein made QMail brilliant, and he is a nut. Love the guy for being a nut, and for QMail and DJB DNS. Okay, sorry. I shouldn't look at the comments while I'm trying to present. Okay, but again, that's why we have a schism and why the cybersecurity posture of modern infrastructure is generally quite horrid. I mean, it's terrifying. Oh, the things I've seen, I can't unsee them. It's in my brain now. And so the solution to the banana problem, and my evolving argument is that the solution to the banana problem is apples. And I do have a half-eaten apple here, or an all-eaten apple here. It's a pink lady apple, delicious. But one of the things that's really fascinating about apples compared to bananas is that we love having a ton of different options as to what apples we can buy. You go to the store and there's one banana. You got a Cavendish banana. You go to the store and there's anywhere from 3 to 15 types of apples. And all of these different apples have different flavor profiles and uses, and it's fun to mix and match apples. And when there are vulnerabilities with a single apple crop, it's probably fairly easy to isolate and move those orchards. And dealing with things like root and fungal diseases from an apple perspective is going to be fundamentally different from dealing with them from a banana problem. And that is because we understand in a fundamental way that there are multiple axioms that will derive positive results. Now, this is one of the hardest things, in my experience at least, that I think people have internalized. It's just this idea. There are multiple answers, fundamental answers, that will derive the same positive end result. There is more than one way of doing things. I kind of hate to say it because it makes me feel like I'm endorsing Pearl. I'm not a huge Pearl fan. But that's how life works. When we are able to step back and say to ourselves, look, there are just plain and simple more ways of solving problems, then we're able to accept that there's nothing necessarily fundamentally wrong with a Granny Smith apple, even if you don't like a Granny Smith apple. And there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the person who likes a Granny Smith apple, even though you think that that's kind of weird for somebody to like a Granny Smith apple, or vice versa. And so what we end up with is that if we're able to take this concept and say, okay, the banana problem is alive and well in tech because we over gravitate towards singular solutions and we swing a pendulum of destruction because of it. That pendulum of destruction swings back and forth because of that over-reliance on polarized ideas. Instead of, again, that understanding that every idea has pluses and minuses, every construct that we build is going to be very useful in different scenarios, and that it's all about being able to build something up that can achieve a complex solution. Because what's really difficult about solving these things in tech is that to achieve balance, you have to have multiple anchors. You cannot over-rely on one idea or construct. And I've just watched this fail over and over and over again. One construct that I'm going to argue has failed is the pets versus cattle construct. There are still people out there who are going to argue with me and say, no, that's the way to do it. But to win my point, there are probably people in this presentation who don't know the pets versus cattle argument. The mere fact that they don't know it means that, no, you didn't have a universal solution that solves everything. Inside of tech, the pets versus cattle argument is that all of your systems should be like cattle. You should be able to care for them en masse, in bulk, in a very similar way. They should all be the same. And that you don't take care of your systems as if they're all pets, where each and every pet needs to be lovingly cared for as an individual system. This is where a broad part of immutable infrastructure comes from. And so the argument I'm giving is that immutable infrastructure is fantastic, and that the pets and cattle argument is a valid argument, but that you can't build a complicated infrastructure alone with these constructs. That you need to compensate for the fact in many scenarios that sometimes you need a dog who is your pet who manages those cows. And that when we look at all these different systems, we have to apply different levels of automation for them. We would be able to have balance in tech and have much more robust solutions if we were able to understand that these are the reasons and the spaces where, let's say, a cattle over pets mindset will universally apply, but also be willing to accept that there are going to be corner cases. We may be able to take a construct like that and put a majority of our weight there. But it's very important still to be able to say that we've got to be able to look at other anchors, other solutions, and other constructs to be able to solve broader problems. And the other thing that we get there is that we're able to have the laser focus that we need applied to a targeted problem instead of trying to oversolve problems using constructs and systems that don't universally resolve those issues. And so what we end up with is, again, going back to the beginning where I was talking about, sometimes it's really good to have a myopic view. Sometimes it's good to have tunnel vision. Sometimes it's good to aggressively embrace a best practice. Because we have to weigh our options. We have to be able to say, look, I know I'm going to need some flexibility. These are areas that I can be flexible on. And these are areas where I know I'm not going to be able to scale there. I may be able to in the future, but not today. These are areas where I must aggressively enforce consistency to achieve my goals and the outcomes. But at the same time, we've got to be able to be flexible enough to understand that there are areas where you will not simply be an enforcer beating a drum, but that we have to compensate for the fact that the real world is going to take risks and the real world is going to get muddy and difficult. And so what we end up with is that balance is hard. Balance has always been hard. Again, we as humans, I'm going to argue, don't like balance. When you're trying to balance on something, it means that you are constantly shifting your weight. You're constantly needing to compensate for little differences and little changes. A gust of wind comes by and you think, oh man, I wish I didn't have to deal with this. And oftentimes that's where we stop trying to balance. We just say, nope, here's a construct that I know is going to work. And I'm not evolving right now. I want to deal with it. But balance mandates that when changes come, we deal with them. We understand them. And then we try to understand what that big picture is going to look like. We don't get aggressively caught up inside of the scope of a new idea. We don't get anchored recklessly to one community or one mindset. We are able to maintain diverse thinking. And in the world of today, where we are doing everything we can to become more diverse, I find it ironic that I would argue the vast majority of us have abandoned diverse thinking. And that we see this so prevalently in tech as well, that we continually decide to embrace myopic technical solutions. We continually look for the panacea that's going to solve all of our problems, instead of understanding that this crap's going to be complicated. It was complicated yesterday, it's complicated today, and it's going to be complicated tomorrow. And we're going to throw more solutions at solving these complicated problems, and they're going to add to the complication of those problems. They're going to give us more scale, more power, more speed. They're going to give us new efficient models and mechanisms. But at the same time, they give us more to learn and more to manage. Balance means simplification. Balance means acceptance of where we are. And it means being able to come back and deal with the fact that, yes, life is a constant struggle. We need to take vacations sometimes. But we've got to be able to compensate for the cold, hard reality that is trying to achieve balance. And so, to sum it up, bananas are vulnerable today because of the universal nature of that crop. But bananas are successful because they're identical. Because of the rigidity of the axiom that was followed for the banana crop. We need to have axioms to deal with complicated things. The cultural aspect of things that we look at today is that when we find a new way of doing things, we therefore must discard and villainize the past. This is unwise and inane thinking, that we think that we can simply discard history and call it a villain. And we do this with tech. It's inane to look back and say, well, there's under no circumstance that we're ever going to need to deal with bare metal hardware again. When the reality today is that the vast majority of computing systems, which are managed and deployed to, and software is deployed to, are bare metal systems. They're phones, they're routers, they're devices. The nature of what we're dealing with just changed and shifted. The ideas that we had in the past didn't go away. We don't throw them away. We understand them. We understand what made them strong. We understand what made them weak. We understand where those problems are. And then we are able to approach complex systems with understanding, and that leads to balance and growth. And one thing that I really like to say that's on this slide is I love old wisdom and new knowledge. So very often we find incredibly wise things from the past that we can build on. People were dumber in the past than they are today. Gene Roddenberry was wrong. I know some people might not like me for saying that. But we are not evolved from human beings 2,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. We're still just people. The wisdom that they had was still derived from generations of learning, and we can still learn from it. And sometimes we don't take it carte blanche, but we're able to look at it and say, why did they come to these conclusions? What were they dealing with? And how can that be applied to today? Which again is why I'm a huge fan of old wisdom and new knowledge. Now, that's all I've got. I appreciate people showing up for my banana problem presentation. This is the presentation where I get to wax philosophical, have a little fun there. Definitely something I enjoy. And I still think it's funny and interesting that people like Chunga have repeatedly told me that they love hearing about the banana problem. Okay, Charles McMorrow has a question for me. Does anyone have a real question for me?
So in terms of Java, it's really important to remember that there are 4 primary different types of coffee beans. You have Arabica, Robusta, Liberica, and Excelsa. And so we do have a lot of that variation in terms of different types of coffee beans than we see in typical commercial or commodity bananas. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, you definitely have diversity inside of coffee. I appreciate that, Patrick. I don't drink coffee. I actually stay away from all caffeine. It wreaks havoc with me. Probably because I've spent most of my life staying away from caffeine. I think that McMorrow was asking about the Java programming language.
Which you also stay away from.
The main reason that so if anybody knows me, I'm not a fan of Java. I'm not a big fan of the Java programming language. And with that said, I understand why we use Java. There are a lot of really good reasons why Java became popular. But the main challenge that I have with Java is exactly what I was just talking about, is that I feel that Java is too myopic in its approach to object-oriented programming, and that it wasn't flexible enough to rethink how software should be developed, and that you shouldn't necessarily just solve all problems with an OOPS style approach. With that said, there are incredible and fascinating and brilliant things that can be done with Java, and that from an object-oriented and a Java perspective, there's a lot that I learned and adapted when in working on POP, and so which goes back to my argument of I don't like the fact that I feel that they went full object-oriented and that's bad, and I'm not a fan of that on one hand. But on the other hand, it's successful for reasons, and I need to understand why it's successful. Otherwise, I'm just throwing away old wisdom. Does that answer your question, Chad? Excellent. Let's see. We've got, what do we have? We got a couple of minutes.
Yeah, 3 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, arguments, or rebuttals?
This stranger, Joey Gibson, wants to know, do you think people confuse the old knowledge with nostalgic thinking?
Definitely. One of the challenges that we run into from an old wisdom perspective is that we end up saying XYZ worked for me in the past, so I'll just do it again. I'm going to argue that that's naive thinking. Generally, it should be something along the lines of saying XYZ did work in the past. Why did it work in the past? What are the aspects of it that made sense? And what are the good things from the past that we are legitimately giving up? So, I mean, if we look at today from a nostalgic thinking perspective, there are a lot of things that we do today that I think is leading to much more widespread mental illness problems. But at the same time, we tend to just say that and not try to understand it. And then we end up with multiple myopic views that say, no, this is the right way to do it at all costs. And both sides say that, or all sides say that. This is the right way to do things at all costs, instead of looking around and trying to make a very balanced decision about these are the resources that we have. These are the situations that we're in, and looking at the past as a toolbox that we can rely on to say these are things that worked in the past. But yeah, as soon as we end up with absolutionist thinking, we create significantly larger problems than we were ever trying to solve. Does that answer your question, comment, or your rebuttal, Joey? One of the problems is I never know if somebody's throwing something into chat like as a joke. Yeah. What about nostalgic thinking? Because I can't see my man Joey's face.
That's true. Most of my add-ins in chat tend to be sarcastic, or at least lead down a ridiculous rabbit hole. There should be a sarcasm font. We could at least use like the Kappa emoji from Twitch or something, which I still
gotta say
never
it
use
in a sarcastic voice.
Yeah, my text is always, well, you can just assume my text is always sarcastic.
I'll keep that in mind the next time I'm asking you for architectural assistance.
There you go. Or customer questions or any of those things.
Oh yeah. All right. Any other questions, or should we break?
Maybe we can give people a little bit of time. And certainly if there are any other, you're right, this is a very good session to wax philosophical. By all means, Tom is always open to any amount of debate about his feelings on various programming languages and paradigms.
Yeah, it's fun to be philosophical.
It's necessary
someday I might build something with that.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your attendance to this session. By all means, there are any number of other things. Chunga just pointed out that there is a replay button over on the nav to the left. So if there are any sessions that you missed, or if you, not that would happen for this specific session, but if you wished you'd watch something else, you have the opportunity to do that. By all means, there is the overall event chat. If there's any continuing conversation you want to have, I do encourage everybody to jump over to the SALT community Slack if there's further discussion that needs to take place. I believe there are a couple of links to that in the overall event chat as well. And then there are, of course, also ways to go into the people tab and handle any direct messaging of anybody if there are follow-ups or QAs. Eating your delicious apple, or any of those things, and definitely a lot of ways. Tom will have his Ask Me Anything in the morning tomorrow, and so any of your banana, apple, or Java related questions can certainly come, or other foods. All of those are valid targets. It literally does say in the abstract, ask him actually anything.
Yeah, and I'll answer Chris Hansen's question really quick with a very terse answer. The metaverse will go the way of Multics. I'll put my money on that. And go look at what happened to Multics. Basically, you had a consortium of a bunch of companies trying to make an operating system, and then a couple of geniuses at AT&T said, Well, this has been fun. My wife's out of town for a few months. Let's make Unix instead. We've learned a lot. And Multics dwindles away. Large-scale corporate collaborations that try and seek making a unified answer don't tend to succeed, but they give seed to new ideas, and then those new ideas succeed. Large, complicated solutions don't get absorbed easily and quickly, and guys like Einstein realized that, which is why he broke down general relativity to E equals mc squared. Something that is consumable and usable and creates a simplified foundation. Unix did that. C did that. They won. Multics didn't. Large-scale corporate amalgamations, they struggle. And the bigger something is, the bigger it is, the harder it falls. And so, yeah, when we look at metaverse and also when we look at things that Facebook is doing, you only make name changes like Facebook is doing. For instance, if your press is just so bad that you've got to make that sort of great name change. Hence, Comcast changing all of their product lines to Xfinity. Nobody liked Comcast. I shouldn't say nobody. Most people didn't like them. Yep, that's right, Eric. Philip Morris to Altria. See, I don't like my stomach. I don't want to vomit when I hear Altria, but I do when I hear Philip Morris. I want to go to war.
Altria sounds too much like a Pokemon name to be mad. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Do appreciate your attendance to this session. There is obviously more to come. I think Tom actually has a break this next session. He finally doesn't have something to present. Do encourage you guys to just quick announcement before we get there. Wayne Werner's talk scheduled for tomorrow morning, A Taste of Testing with Salt, has moved to this next time slot. Dave Boucher's talk on SaltStack SecOps has moved to that same spot. They transposed places from tomorrow morning to this next session. So look forward to seeing you guys in any of the other sessions. By all means, engage any of the overall event chat or any of the people things. I think they added a direct video chat option to some of those things. So there are many, many ways to get a hold of anybody if you want extended conversations about any of the things that you're hearing about. There is, again, that replay feature over on the left. And finally, all of the videos of all of these sessions should be available in the coming weeks. Thank you, everybody.
Adios.